And welcome back. So the next thing we'll be talking about is technology and working remotely. Part of the driver for this is that the cost of a 3-minute telephone call over the past 70 years has drastically reduced in price. So we see from this graph from the book that back in 1930, if you wanted to have a 3-minute telephone call from New York to London, transatlantic telephone call, we're talking about hundreds of dollars just to make this call. Whereas now we're talking about, just a few dollars to maybe tens of dollars. This, coupled with the introduction of personal computers in the 1980s and the steep decline in their cost, has allowed for mass proliferation of technology, and especially communication technology. And we can see this in looking at the Pew Research Center studies and surveys on the amount of technology that people own over the past 25 or so years. And we see the internet's become, starting off in 1994 with 6% of US adults having access to the internet, to almost 90% of US adults in 2018. And that number is probably increased. Likewise with cell phones have mass penetration at 95% of US adults, to desktop computers or smartphones or some sort of smart device, to 3 out of every 4 Americans. This isn't all a good thing, or working remotely isn't all a good thing, as we've come to understand in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic, where there's now being a lot of content published about how to not go crazy when you're working from home, like this article here from Forbes. But this has really been a transformational way for people to get work done, and has transformed how people engage, not just with their employer, but with the whole concept of having a job. And some of the technology that makes this easy is of course, email. So you don't have to rely on snail mail or regular mail to send messages. Now you can send messages instantaneously. To instant communication and chat room technology like Slack. Chat rooms like this have been around for 20 or so years, but Slack has really marketed itself as a new way for groups to come together and work, even if they are working from very, very distant places. So this has brought about a number of organizational changes driven by how information technology is integrating into companies. So now things like payroll or other sort of automated functions are being replaced by information technology. This is another example of automation. And this technology has really allowed for or facilitated and eased communication among employees, even if they're in different offices, different buildings, completely different business units across entire companies. So as a result, organizations aren't near as hierarchical as they used to be. It's now much easier to reach out to the CEO of your company than it used to be. So whereas before email, you might have had to send a letter or physically go to a different building or up to the executive suite, or you might have a barrier between you and some executive through their staff assistant or something. And now you can email this person directly, oftentimes, or you can send them a message on Slack, or send them a text message or an instant message or something like that. And now we have remote offices, sort of far-flung places abroad. One of the companies I work with has a lot of small satellite offices basically all across the country, from DC to Alabama to Texas to Denver to Seattle, and each one of these offices is staffed by probably no more than like 10 or so people. So as I mentioned, so on the A part of this figure, this is the traditional hierarchical sort of company structure where communication was only through these well-defined lines. But now with the proliferation of communication technology, like instant messaging and email and these kinds of things, it's much easier to just reach out to anybody. But it doesn't always, these technologies don't uniformly affect all jobs. So for instance, this is another figure from the book, use of technology or information technology increases demand for certain job categories, but not others, right? And this sort of falls in what you'd expect. So computer systems analysts or network system administrators and software engineers, these are changing, or these jobs are becoming much higher demand as this kind of technology or information technology propagates or gets more enmeshed into the way we do business, especially now where everybody's working from home, whereas other kinds of jobs are experiencing, not significant changes, like butchers or cashiers, although cashiers to some degree have been impacted by self-checkout. And then others are other kinds of jobs that are encountering even lower demand, or their demand is decreasing. So like secretaries and stenographers, it makes much less sense to have a stenographer working for you when you can use automated speech-to-text capabilities, even though such speech-to-text capabilities tend to be pretty not great in a lot of places. If you've ever tried to talk to Siri or Google, you may have experienced that. But we can see that this has led to a very different kind of landscape, especially in the United States, in terms of technology and the economy. So this is a map of manufacturing and different kinds of economic sectors in the United States in 1990. And if we play this movie forward, we can see how this changes over time, with manufacturing starting to decrease, retail increasing in popularity, and then into the 2000s, retail is the primary industry. But as we get into closer to 2010, we start to see more healthcare and social assistance, and more healthcare and social assistance. To by 2009 and 2010, one of the primary sources of economic growth in the United States is in healthcare and social assistance, a sector that essentially didn't exist in 1990. With this, technology has changed, like I said, it's changed how people engage with their office or working from their desk. So this is the rise of remote work. So for a long time, this was called telework. You may still hear this term thrown around, but it's this idea of working from home or working through your telephone, away from the traditional place of work. So things that you might expect, like the home office, people working from home, very comfortable, or not necessarily comfortable, but very familiar to that with that now. But also your salesperson or your road warrior who's out on the road working basically from their laptop. I used to do this and can work wherever my laptop happens to be. Or the self-employed or freelance work who can work, like I said, wherever their laptop happens to be. Recently, there was a study about 40% of the workforce in the United States works remotely with some degree of frequency. Many companies allow telework, once a week, or some sort of scheduled telework, or just allow people to telework whenever they like. And there are a lot of advantages to this. The claim is that telework or remote work increases productivity. It provides employees with additional flexibility. This is especially valuable in times of unrest or times of disaster, like we see now, where companies can continue to work even though their employees are not physically co-located. The theory goes that this improves morale because employees are more empowered and feel like they have more control over their workspace and their work environment. And are more productive. They are happier in their job. It increases recruitment and retention of top employees for the same kinds of reasons. Saves on overhead because there's no point in paying huge amounts of rent in very expensive markets like Manhattan in New York, when you can have people work from home and you don't have to pay for an office. Also, this nicely reduces environmental impact because people can reduce the amount of time they drive to work or sit in traffic. Improves company resilience. This is the disaster response or response to times of unrest, where it makes it much easier for a company to continue to operate even if something happens to their primary office. And we see that there are nice infographics around working remotely about how it's increased collaboration across business units and across offices. Studies have shown it increases productivity between 15 and 50%. And this reduction of geographic boundaries allows people to work anywhere and engage with a much more diverse population. And one of the things that we've talked about and we'll talk about more is how diversity in stakeholders is a really valuable thing to make sure that your technology is less biased or better serves the needs of your customer. But that's not to say that remote work is all sunshine and roses. So one of the things that we've run into is that when you don't have face-to-face time with your managers, you have a lot less control over your employees. And this is partially because it's much more difficult to do oversight when you're not seeing them physically. And because you have more physical distance between your employers and your managers, it's less. There's less perceived authority there. Face-to-face meetings become more complicated. Your mic's not on, or your image is frozen in your video teleconference. This is very frustrating and can lead to all kinds of technical difficulties. The idea of having a multi-party video conference call has been around since the 1960s, but still today we still have problems getting this technology to work. One of the things that is particularly concerning now as people move to working from home is if you work in a controlled environment like an office, you can have an IT group who's dedicated to making sure that that office is secure, or that the network in that office is secure. But as you have people working from far-flung places, you necessarily have to punch holes in your security infrastructure to allow them to connect to each other. This makes things inherently less secure. Because remote workers are less visible physically, they're also more isolated. This has led to people trying to respond to this with virtual happy hours or virtual coffee hours. A couple of my colleagues do this once a week to address the social isolation of social distancing. And some of the recent studies show that remote workers tend to work longer hours because they feel compelled to, since they're not sitting in traffic, or they feel like they have to work more because other times when they're at work and they're sitting around the water cooler, or they're going to lunch or something like that, those might be considered productive, or those might be considered work hours, even though they're less productive because they are at work. And whereas when they're at home, they may feel like they have to make up for that time where they would be doing lunch or would be sitting in traffic. So on average, this results in about 5 to 7 hours more work per week. Well, this is nice if you work on an hourly rate. If you are salaried, then you are essentially working more for the same pay, or you're getting paid less. And more recently, or more contemporarily, this is the working from home during a global pandemic bingo, where we see some of these issues brought up, like putting your pants on before dialing in, only hear every fifth word of your telephone conference, the screen freezes but sound keeps going, all these kinds of things that become very frustrating, especially when you are dealing with them on a constant basis, that can really impact productivity and potentially impact or offset the productivity gains from the additional flexibility of being able to work from home. So, and this doesn't necessarily impact everybody the same way. So my preference actually is not to work from home. I prefer to work in coffee shops or places away from my home, but I know many people feel differently. But this kind of flexibility has really changed the way people view work, because this additional flexibility alters the bond between companies and employees. Then employees start to feel less loyalty to the company, and has allowed them to sort of expand the kinds of jobs they can do. And this has led to the rise of the gig economy, which we'll talk about. We'll define that in a minute. And as a result of this, we see a massive increase in globalization, making the world a smaller place, which is nice from the standpoint of efficiency. But as we've seen with the pandemic, it has downsides, making things like disease very easy to spread rapidly over very long distances. So what is the gig economy? It's this economy made up of three major components. The first is you have some independent worker who wants to get paid and wants to do some job, and their pay is based on these individual jobs, or the gig. You have some consumer who needs some specific service, so they want to have something done, either a delivery or small job or something like that. And then you have some company or individual who exists between the worker and the consumer, and this company's job is to connect these two other stakeholders. And there are many, many examples of this for grocery delivery, like Instacart or Peapod, Many kinds of restaurant food delivery systems or companies which have become increasingly critical during current events, so like Uber Eats and Grubhub and DoorDash. There are all kinds of delivery things like Amazon Flex. There are specific task-oriented gig economy sites, so like TaskRabbit or Amazon Mechanical Turk, where you don't pay for a specific service like food delivery, you pay for some task that you define. There are car rental things, tutoring, parking rentals, all kinds of different ways where somebody has some service or asset they're willing to provide to some other person, and all these companies exist to connect these service providers with some consumer who wants that service. In some sense, the gig economy is valuable. In some sense, there are downsides to it, so we can talk about the consequences of that now. The idea is that with the gig economy, workers have much more flexibility. They don't work for a specific company. They have a lot more flexibility and agency in choosing their work, choosing when they work. This is one of the supposed values behind being an Uber driver, is you get to decide when you are going to drive or when you're going to work. But at the same time, because there's much more agency on the part of the workers, companies feel less committed to these workers. And we see that in reductions and consequences for layoffs. So if I don't contract with you as an actual employee, instead you are a gig worker or some freelancer, then rather than firing you, I don't have to give you any more work. And then you have to go find work elsewhere, even though I've not actually fired you. And as a result, companies feel like they can benefit from hiring more subcontractors and temporary employees, so they don't have to provide these individuals with as much benefits, partially because workers have more flexibility and are less tied to the company, so part of that is they have to pay their own way more, but this becomes more expensive for workers, especially when things like health insurance are extremely expensive. And then companies can downsize and respond to demand more easily by not firing people, but just providing less work to their subcontractors and temporary employees. Now, in some sense, that's valuable in making companies lean and responsive, but in other ways, this is a negative for the worker. Let's see. So while proponents or people who support the gig economy say that this is good for workers because they gain independence and flexibility, the critics say that these jobs are sort of last resort jobs, that if you could get a longer term job, then you would. And I think to some degree that's probably fair. Like freelance journalists can go anywhere and write their stories and ship them or sell them to any journalistic organization. But would it be better to have the clout of a major journalistic organization behind you when you were doing your job? I think probably so. And as a result, if you have many people who are in the gig economy all competing against each other, and you have little reputational incentive or little reputational information to identify the best workers, it's difficult to provide an incentive to pay high wages. So as a result of this competition, wages tend to be a lot lower. So Robert Reich, one of the major donors to the Democratic Party, talks about how big money that goes to these corporations in the gig economy go to the organizations that own software that connects, or that acts as the middleman, connecting these consumers to the workers who actually do the tasks. But then only some very small percentage goes to these on-demand workers, meaning that the vast majority of the value of the gig economy is only realized by a small portion of the economy. And we see this with Uber and Lyft, where Uber drivers and Lyft drivers in California filed suit to be classified as employees by these companies to provide them with more, so the companies would provide them with more benefits or be required to provide them with more benefits. And this lawsuit actually won in California. In terms of the ethical theories that we've talked about in class, we can sort of evaluate the gig economy from the standpoint of social contract theory and John Rawls' rules of justice. So if we look at the gig economy, we can ask, is there inequality in the gig economy? And the answer is yes. There are always going to be people who have more money or less money. And the next question then becomes, does the gig economy concentrate inequality? And if so, into whose hands does this inequality get concentrated? And the answer to this is a lot of the power goes to the organizations that do the connection. So if you work for Uber and then Uber decides they don't like you, or your rating drops too low, then Uber can just kick you off of their rideshare program and you can't work for them anymore. Same thing with DoorDash or a lot of these sort of middleman gig economy connection companies. So the consumer doesn't have a relationship with the individual driver. The consumer has a relationship with the middleman company. So given that there's very little recourse for these gig workers to respond if they are kicked off of these platforms. So from that standpoint, the gig economy definitely concentrates inequality, and it does so into the hands of these middlemen who already have lots of power and have a lot of resources to own and run these organizations. And this sets up a lot of tension between workers and these companies. So as I mentioned, in California, Lyft drivers and Uber drivers filed suit against these companies and they won. But despite that, Uber is claiming that they're not going to abide by that ruling, and they're not going to treat drivers as employees. And their claim for this is that drivers are not core to Uber's business model, which is kind of a strange thing for a rideshare company to say, but here we are. So as I mentioned, there are different versions of the gig economy when I showed you all the different kinds of organizations that provide some sort of gig economy-like service. So Uber and ride sharing, Amazon Mechanical Turk, and it's supposed to be, well, you have some time that you want to dedicate to some small task, so you can do that through Mechanical Turk, where the asset's time. Airbnb is a similar kind of thing where people have an asset of their home or a room in their home and they want to make that asset available. Uber was originally about making people's cars available, these kinds of things. So it's all about having some individual with an asset or some service that they want to provide some consumer. But there's value in this. One of the things, so we can't just say, oh, this is all bad. So there's some studies that show that when Uber comes to a new city, or this ride-sharing program comes to new cities, the incidence of drunk driving decreases. So that's an overall pro-social thing. By making it easier for people to get rides to places, it makes people more mobile. It decreases the cost of moving around, which in general empowers individuals in the public, which is a useful thing. Going back to the concentration of inequality in the gig economy, we can ask this question about who has the most power and who is the most likely to be exploited. So in terms of who has the most power, we've already addressed that. It's almost certainly these middlemen or these consumer to worker connector organizations. And then who is the most likely to be exploited in the gig economy? So it's likely not to be the middleman, since they're the ones with the most power. So then the other two stakeholders are the consumers and the workers. Now the consumers, since their relationship is primarily with the middleman, and they can choose to use other organizations where they have income that they're trying to dispose of for some service, it's less likely that they're going to be exploited, because then the middleman suffers some reputational cost here, and then the consumer would go elsewhere. So at the end of the day, the stakeholder who's most likely to be exploited here is the worker, who has little recourse if the connector organization decides to pay them less or just kick them off completely. So when we look in the gig economy, we can ask, so who can work a gig? Who might take part in the gig economy? And the idea is anybody, anyone as long as they can fulfill some service, but this results in an issue of global competition. So if anyone can fulfill the needs of a particular gig or a particular task, then who might an individual worker be competing against? And the answer is everybody. And this leads to massive globalization, because now if I'm going to post a task like image labeling or text annotation or speech to text kinds of tasks onto a website that is available globally, then some person in the United States may have to compete with some person in Africa or some person in China or some person in India for the same task. So we can define globalization for the rest of this conversation as the growing interdependence of the world's economies, cultures, and populations brought about by cross-border trade in goods and services, technology, and flows of investment, people, and information. So basically it's the weakening of borders or making borders more porous and making all kinds of things from people to information flow globally more easily. Now, in some sense, this is valuable, or in some ways this is valuable. So the economics of interdependence in a globalized world really suppresses conflict. So this is one of the key outcomes of World War II, whereas global economies became more connected, it became much more difficult for an individual country to risk the calculus of large-scale conflicts and wars, knowing that their economy is likely very highly tied to the economies of somebody who they might go to war against. So there's this study here about the impact of economic interdependence on the probability of conflict between states, and it talks about how the massive economic relationship and interdependence between America and China has resulted in a stabilization of relationships and lack of conflict, despite there being pressure points and pain points between the two countries on issues like Taiwan. So this suggests that there are real advantages of globalization. So increased competition generally drives down prices or makes for higher quality goods. So we saw this in the United States with the introduction of Japanese cars that really forced American car manufacturers to increase quality. People in poorer countries deserve jobs as well, and they can work on more sophisticated jobs and not have to rely on manual labor jobs, since they can, in theory, just as easily or just as readily compete in technical jobs. Globalization is a tried and true route for poor countries to become prosperous by engaging in this larger economy or larger global economy. Countries can really lift themselves out of poverty. And by related to the comment I made about China and the United States, these global jobs reduce unrest and increase global stability, which is definitely nice. But there are definitely disadvantages here. So it concentrates power in these sort of transnational organizations like the World Trade Organization or global corporations that can very easily move from country to country and may not be limited by local laws or local jurisdictions of individual countries. And domestic workers now have to compete with foreign workers, and in some sense that's good, this sets up some inequalities. So, for instance, foreign workers may not get paid decent wages. Foreign workers or foreign governments may not impose the same safety standards. So, while in the United States it may be very expensive to have clothing manufactured here, because OSHA and governmental organizations require companies to put a lot of money into providing safe factories. In other countries, this is not the case, and because these other countries provide less or require less safe factories or have less stringent requirements on safety, then less money can be put into safety, and you get cost savings. Now, does that result in fair competition? Potentially not. In fact, rather than being fair, some claim that this is in fact exploitive of workers in foreign countries, because it gives the government no incentive, or the governments of these foreign countries little incentive to increase safety standards or these kinds of standards that might result in increased costs, which is the primary driver for why they're getting business in the first place. And this is a societal issue that we continually address or continually wrestle with in the United States. So, for instance, while the United States has its IT industry has mechanisms for allowing foreign workers to work in the United States, which with the H-1B visa. Uh, these can be relatively restrictive. You can work in the United States for 6 years, but a company who's going to get an H-1B visa for a foreign worker has to show that no qualified Americans were available to take that job. And Congress has a limit on how many H-1B visas can be offered per year, with that limit being in the tens of thousands. There are other kinds of visas, though, like the L1 visa, which allows a company to transfer workers from overseas to the United States. But critically, workers who are transferred this way do not need to be paid the prevailing wage, meaning that I can ship somebody here to the United States and have them work for me but not be subject to the same sort of minimum wage standards that other people or other domestic workers have to abide by, meaning that it becomes even harder for low-wage workers in the United States to compete. And this has led to a lot of political conflict around foreign competition. So, for instance, China is the world's #1 producer of computer hardware. IT outsourcing to India was massively popular in the 90s, 2000s, and early 2010s before sufficient consumer backlash stopped some of it. But then this moved outsourcing to other countries instead of India. And in the United States, there is some claim that this has resulted in less prestige for the United States, which we see with the ACM Collegiate Programming Contest, where no American team has placed first in the past 20-odd years. In fact, from 2011 to 2015, only one of 20 teams earning gold medals was from the United States. Now, that's not necessarily bad. That definitely shows that there's global competition, which is a good thing, and it shows that other countries are producing extremely top quality kinds of organizations, which is great globally. But it does increase competition for domestic workers, which has resulted in political issues. So some of the discussion questions you might see are like, given two candidates of equivalent skill, but one is domestic and more expensive, and one is international, who would you hire? Now, this is an interesting question because it touches on things like communications or the productivity losses that you might have to incur if your international hire is on the exact opposite side of the world and you have to deal with time zones, but maybe the cost savings are worth it. You have to balance these kinds of things. But it also touches on this issue of whether two candidates of equivalent skill should be paid the same regardless of location. So should somebody who is equally skilled to someone in the United States demand the same kind of pay if they live in a country that has a much lower cost of living standard? I don't have a good answer to that. My feeling is cost of living, even the cost of living differences in the United States have a lot of influence. So doing the job, a given job in Manhattan or DC is going to be more expensive than doing that same job in Alabama or the Midwest by virtue of cost of living differences, which is primarily driven by things like demand around housing. And then how does technology fit into all of this? So we talked about how technology enables remote work, how technology enables communication. So technology is definitely a facilitator of globalization here. By allowing or creating technology or pieces of hardware like Facebook Portal or Skype for Business, or all of these kinds of things that allow people to engage with their coworkers much more readily. So that's all we'll talk about in terms of globalization and transforming the workplace. So now we can go back to the learning objectives for today's class, where hopefully you'll be able to describe at least one way automation has impacted employment. We can talk about different kinds or different scenarios where automation is appropriate versus not appropriate, identifying ways technology has facilitated remote work, disadvantages and advantages of remote work, and then things around or issues around the gig economy where in some sense it is a positive and in some sense it's a negative. Again, as in all things in this class, nothing is truly like black and white and good and bad. Things are complicated. And hopefully as you go through and think about these discussion questions, that'll become apparent. All right, so that's it for today. For next week, we have some assignments to talk about. There are 5 current event presentations for next week for Nilofer, Matt, Jeremiah, Elijah, and Anshul. Remember that you have the online discussion questions around each lecture, so you're required to respond to at least 2 of the provided prompts and respond to at least 2 students. And then for next week, also read Chapter 7 and take the quiz on Chapter 7. All right, well, that's it. Enjoy the rest of your day, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email or on Canvas. Thank you very much, and stay healthy.